a black teenager was slapped mid-flight for no reason. What happened next, and the person who stood up for him, changed every life on that plane. At 16, Elijah Carter already knew what it meant to carry the weight of expectations. Not just the kind that came with being a finalist in the National Science Decathlon, but the quieter, heavier ones, the kind no one ever said aloud. He was the son of Dr. Samuel Carter, one of Atlanta's most respected cardiothoracic surgeons, a man who had spent his life navigating two worlds: the sterile, white-walled precision of operating rooms and the quiet prejudice of high society charity galas. Elijah had grown up hearing the phrase, "You have to be twice as good to get half as far," and he'd taken it to heart. That morning at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Gate C-42 buzzed with activity. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, the faint hiss of espresso machines in the distance, all the usual noise of transit. But Elijah could only focus on the man pacing beside him. "You got your boarding pass?" his father asked for the third time in 15 minutes. Elijah, clutching his small carry-on and his well-worn backpack, offered a patient smile. "Yes, Dad. It's still in the wallet you gave me. Same as it was 5 minutes ago." Dr. Carter gave a short nod, the kind that said he knew he was being excessive but couldn't help himself. Anxiety, in his case, always dressed up as efficiency. "And your presentation files?" "Saved on my laptop, backed up in the cloud, emailed to Professor Diaz, and copied to a USB drive. You made me double-check." "I'm ready, Dad." Elijah tried to soften the edge in his voice. He knew his father didn't mean to hover. It was love disguised as logistics. And beneath it all, a more delicate truth. This was the first time Elijah would travel completely alone since his mother had left for a temporary sabbatical in Paris nearly a year ago. That 6-week trip had stretched into something indefinite, and the silence that followed had been deafening. Dr. Carter sighed, tall and straight-backed in his fitted blazer, the sleeves creased just right. "You've got this, son," he said, placing both hands on Elijah's shoulders. "Not just the competition, all of it. I'm proud of how you've handled everything." Elijah nodded, throat tightening just a little. They didn't talk much about his mother, not the fact that she hadn't been there for his birthday. Not the way the house felt colder without her humming in the kitchen. Not the loneliness he tried to outpace with academic trophies and extracurriculars. But when his father said all of it, Elijah understood. "I should get in line," he said, nodding toward the boarding call. "Call me when you land, and again before the competition. And after. Win or lose. I know the drill." Elijah grinned, and Dr. Carter laughed, a rare moment of ease. Then, unexpectedly, the doctor pulled him into a fierce hug. Not the formal shoulder pat kind, but the real kind, the kind that speaks when words can't. "I love you," he said. "I love you too, Dad." As Elijah turned toward the gate, his backpack slung over one shoulder, he felt the tug of conflicting emotions. Irritation at his father's fussing, gratitude for the care beneath it, and that constant pressure to succeed, not just for himself, but for every kid who looked like him and didn't get this kind of opportunity. He reached the boarding line just as a man in a tailored grey suit stepped in front of him. Elijah nearly bumped into him. The man turned with a sharp glance. "Careful there, young man." "First time flying?" The tone wasn't hostile, but there was a tightness to it, a subtle arch of the brow that made Elijah straighten his posture instinctively. "No, sir. Just momentarily distracted." "My apologies." The man's expression shifted, surprise flickered, then a curt nod. He turned back around without another word. Elijah had seen that look before, the quick recalibration when someone's assumptions didn't match reality. A tall black teenager in jeans and a hoodie who spoke like a valedictorian that always threw people off. As the line shuffled forward, a soft voice behind him said, "Excuse me." He turned to find an older woman with elegant white hair and a kind smile. Her clothes were practical but expensive, the kind of taste that whispered rather than shouted. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, her southern lilt warm. Elijah braced himself for the usual follow-up. "Yes, ma'am." "Headed to Los Angeles for the National Science Decathlon." Her smile brightened. "My grandson competed in that last year. Didn't make the finals, but he's at Georgia Tech now." Elijah's shoulders eased a little. "That's actually one of my top choices." "You must be quite talented," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Grace Chen." "Elijah Carter," he replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm. "My project's on gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers." Her eyes sparkled. "Fascinating. My late husband would have loved that." He was part of the Apollo program. Before Elijah could respond, the gate agent called for first-class boarding. Grace gave him a small wave. "Perhaps we'll continue this conversation on board." "Good luck in the competition." Elijah smiled. For a moment, he forgot the nervous flutter in his chest. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all. But that hope would vanish 20 minutes later, when he found himself assigned to seat 16B, wedged between a girl reading Dune and the man in the grey suit, now deeply immersed in a tablet. The man glanced up, then sighed as he stood. "I'd hoped you'd be in another section," he muttered. Elijah didn't respond. He was used to shrinking into small spaces, used to reading the room before speaking. But something about the edge in that voice, the presumption of superiority, it settled under his skin like a splinter. As he sat down, the girl next to him whispered, "They really should make these seats for actual human bodies." He turned, surprised. She smiled, brown hair tucked behind one ear. "I'm Lena." "Elijah," he said. That one moment, a shared smile, a small kindness, would become the beginning of something bigger than either of them could imagine. Because on this flight, at 36,000 feet, history wasn't just behind them, it was about to catch up. The plane smelled faintly of overused air and plastic coffee cups. Elijah Carter squeezed past Gregory Tate's knees into the dreaded middle seat, careful not to brush against him. The man barely shifted, muttering something under his breath about personal space, loud enough for Elijah to hear, but not enough for a confrontation. To Elijah's left, by the window, Lena Ruiz offered a sympathetic smirk. She was about his age, maybe a year older, with olive-toned skin, bright amber eyes, and a personality that shimmered through even the dim light of the cabin. A battered paperback copy of Dune rested in her lap, open and well-loved. "They really should hand out medals for surviving economy class," she whispered, angling her body slightly toward him, "especially for whoever has to sit in the middle." Elijah chuckled softly, grateful for the warmth in her voice. "I'll take a trophy when we land." "Lena," she said, extending her hand. "Elijah," he replied, shaking it. Her handshake, like her presence, was firm but kind. Before their conversation could deepen, Gregory Tate exhaled loudly beside them and began typing aggressively on his tablet. Every finger tap landed like a gavel. His jaw clenched, his posture rigid, and he exuded the kind of silent disapproval that Elijah had felt his entire life from men like that. Men who didn't need to say out loud that you didn't belong. You just knew. Lena leaned in closer, whispering, Bet he's a blast at parties. Elijah stifled a grin. Big fun uncle energy. They shared a quiet laugh, their moment of connection quickly squashed by a sharp clearing of a throat. Some of us are trying to work, Gregory snapped, eyes still glued to his screen. Of course, Lena replied sweetly, her sarcasm delicately wrapped in politeness. Wouldn't want to disrupt your very important spreadsheets. Gregory didn't answer, but his neck turned a deeper shade of red. He pulled his elbow closer, subtly encroaching on the shared armrest, forcing Elijah to retreat a bit. It was a familiar game, one he'd played in school hallways, at academic conferences, even in restaurants. This silent negotiation for space, for dignity, for the right to simply be. Elijah looked down at his lap, fingers tightening around the hem of his hoodie. Usually, he'd just give in. But something about today, his father's hug, Lena's confidence, made him feel like maybe he didn't have to. He quietly reclaimed a few inches of armrest. Gregory flinched slightly, but said nothing. Small victory. But it mattered. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Lena slid a notepad onto her tray and scribbled something quickly. She passed it to Elijah, careful not to attract attention. He seems fun. Bet he gives great TED Talks on respect. Elijah grinned and jotted back, He definitely yells at baristas when they get his name wrong. Their fingers brushed as she passed the pen again. Lena's shoulders trembled with silent laughter. Gregory cast a long, annoyed look in their direction, but said nothing. Elijah could feel the tension growing in the man like steam in a sealed pot. "First time to L.A.?" Lena asked, scribbling the words this time instead of speaking. Elijah nodded and wrote back, "Science competition. You?" She answered with a smile and a note. "Visiting my mom. Divorced parents. I'm the human ping-pong ball." Then came the lurch as the plane accelerated, wheels leaving the earth. Elijah's hand instinctively gripped the armrest. And then softly, Lena's hand found his, a brief, steadying touch, a small act of kindness. The gesture settled something in him. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes as the plane climbed into the sky. In the world below, the rules were uneven, the looks were long, and boys like him had to be careful with every move. But up here, briefly, he felt lighter. Across the aisle, Gregory Tate watched the teens with narrowed eyes. His mouth was a tight line, his jaw visibly flexing. There was a time, not long ago, when people like Elijah knew their place, at least in Gregory's mind. That time, thankfully, had passed for most, but not for him. 7 rows back, in seat 23D, Henry Callahan watched too, but not with judgment. His gaze was different. He'd noticed Gregory Tate the moment he boarded. Men, like him, didn't change much with age. Henry had seen the type back in '75, both in the jungles of Vietnam and in the streets of Georgia when he returned. The suits were nicer now, the language more coded, but the superiority complex was the same. Watching Elijah, a boy with grace and patience well beyond his years, trying to navigate that hostility, stirred something in Henry that had been buried for decades. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the photo he always carried. He didn't need to look at it to know the faces. One of them was James Henderson, and the other was himself. As the beverage cart rolled past, the aisle narrowed, confining everyone to their small spaces, physically and emotionally. The metal walls of the plane seemed to shrink. Gregory buzzed for a flight attendant. "I paid for a seat where I could work in peace," he said, gesturing slightly at Elijah and Lena without naming them. "Is there any possibility of moving me?" The attendant, a tall black woman with a polished name tag that read Danielle Harris, offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. We're at full capacity today." "No seats are available." Gregory's voice dropped to a whisper, but not low enough. "They're passing notes." Giggling. "It's unprofessional." Lena opened her mouth to speak, but Danielle raised a finger gently, the universal sign. "Let me handle this." "I understand your concern, sir," she said evenly, "but they're not in violation of any policy. We do encourage courtesy among passengers. I'm sure everyone can make an effort to be respectful." Gregory huffed, but said nothing. Danielle nodded at Elijah, her glance brief but reassuring, then moved on. As she passed the galley, she whispered to her co-worker, Andre Wilson, "Keep an eye on row 16. Andre followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "Copy that." For the next 30 minutes, an uneasy silence settled over row 16. Gregory Tate had gone cold and quiet, his fingers still pecking at his tablet, though less aggressively now. Every so often, he sighed long, deliberate exhales designed to remind the two teens beside him of his displeasure. He didn't speak to them again, but his disapproval hung in the air like stale coffee. Lena Ruiz had tried to resume conversation once or twice, whispering light-hearted comments about science fiction and turbulence, but Elijah Carter had grown quieter, his smile thinner. He was slipping into that familiar mode of calculated stillness, one he knew too well. It was the posture of survival in uncomfortable spaces. Sit straight, be polite, don't provoke. He was trying not to be noticed. Danielle Harris, the lead flight attendant, passed by row 16 several times during the snack service. Each time, she checked in with a glance that lingered on Elijah just a second longer than necessary. She said nothing, but her eyes said everything. She saw what was happening. Andre Wilson had picked up on it too. After years of working in the air, he and Danielle had developed a sixth sense for tension. Sometimes it was a couple mid-divorce, sometimes a drunk traveler, and sometimes, like now, it was something more insidious. The kind of thing that didn't show up in the safety manual, but left a deeper scar if left unaddressed. As Danielle handed Elijah a packet of pretzels and a cup of water, she leaned in just slightly. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her voice friendly but careful. Gregory answered before Elijah could. "Everything's fine," he said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just having a quiet flight." Elijah nodded faintly. "Yes, ma'am, all good." Danielle didn't press. She offered a gentle nod and moved on, but made a note to return. After the flight attendants had rolled past, Lena passed Elijah another note, written hastily on a napkin. "If he says anything weird when I'm not here, tell me. My mom's a lawyer." She'd destroy him. Elijah smiled, not just because of the note, but because of what it meant. Support. A willingness to speak up. He wasn't used to that. He'd spent most of his life managing these encounters alone, small slights, quiet insults, coded language. There was always the temptation to pretend they weren't happening. It made things easier. It made you look stronger. But Lena's friendship reminded him he didn't always have to endure things in silence. He wrote back, "Thanks. I'll let you know if I need legal backup." She winked. Gregory shifted again in his seat, jostling Elijah's elbow. This time, Elijah didn't move. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Near the back of the plane, Henry Callahan hadn't taken his eyes off row 16 for more than a few moments. He saw the signs. The stiff shoulders, the clipped tones, the tension that radiated like heat through a closed window. He knew what was brewing because he'd seen it before, in another lifetime, in another uniform. He still remembered the cold silence that would fall in the barracks when a black soldier walked in. The way voices would drop and glances would cut like knives. He remembered a young man named James Henderson, calm, capable, endlessly patient. James had taught him how to read people without needing a single word spoken. And now, all these years later, Henry saw the same signs in Elijah, the same caution, the same quiet strength. He didn't know yet that Elijah was James's grandson, but something inside him stirred. The connection wasn't logical, not yet. But it was there, tugging gently like a tide against his better judgment. He opened the journal in his lap, the one he had brought to pass time, but his eyes didn't read the words. He watched. He waited. Meanwhile, back in row 16, the seatbelt sign turned off. Elijah seized the opportunity for a quick escape. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Gregory. "I need to use the restroom." Gregory took his time standing. He made a production of it, shuffling, sighing, adjusting his blazer. Elijah slid past him without a word, nodding briefly to Lena as he passed. She handed him something discreetly as he walked by. Once he reached the restroom, he unfolded the napkin. "That guy gives me the creeps." Elijah chuckled softly, grateful for the momentary break from the pressure. He stayed in the cramped lavatory longer than necessary, staring at his reflection in the tiny mirror. His face looked older than it had that morning. Just slightly. His posture, always careful, felt a little tighter now. He ran his hands under cold water, then dried them and stepped out. As he made his way back down the aisle, he noticed that Gregory and Lena were in conversation. Or rather, Gregory was talking, leaning toward Lena, his tone low, his hand gesturing sharply. Elijah slowed his steps, catching just enough of the conversation to feel his stomach twist. "I'm simply saying," Gregory was saying, "you should be more careful about the company you keep." Lena's face was tight. Her hands gripped the armrests. She looked like she was trying not to explode. "Is everything okay?" Elijah asked, standing beside the row. Lena looked at him with immediate relief. "Fine," she said quickly. "Mr. Tate was just giving me advice I didn't ask for." Gregory leaned back, flashing that same fake smile. "Just looking out for her." Young ladies sometimes don't recognize danger until it's too late. Elijah didn't react, not outwardly, but inside, something was changing. He slid back into his seat. Lena leaned in, her voice low and furious. "He waited until you left to start lecturing me. Told me I should be careful who I sit next to, that my parents wouldn't approve. Can you believe that?" Elijah could. He'd heard it before in different words, different tones, but always the same meaning. "Ignore him," Elijah said quietly. "We've got 3 hours left. Then he's out of our lives." Lena looked like she wanted to argue, to call Gregory out directly. But Elijah's calm expression convinced her to let it go. For now. Across the aisle, Gregory Tate returned to his tablet, but his fingers didn't move for several minutes. He stared at the screen, jaw tight, expression unreadable. 7 rows back, Henry Callahan closed his journal, placed it in his seat pocket, and reached down to adjust his shoelaces. It was a meaningless motion. But for Henry, it was a decision. He wouldn't just watch anymore. The cabin had settled into its typical mid-flight rhythm, half lit, half silent, somewhere between boredom and drowsiness. Tray tables were down, headphones were on, window shades lowered. A few passengers were already dozing, their heads tilted at awkward angles, but not in row 16. There, tension hadn't dissolved with altitude. It had only thickened. Gregory Tate hadn't spoken again since his quiet warning to Lena. He didn't need to. His body language did all the talking. He kept his arms rigid, knees wide, claiming more than his share of space. He cleared his throat sharply any time Lena and Elijah exchanged more than a sentence. And when Lena let out a quiet laugh at something Elijah scribbled on the napkin, Gregory muttered just loud enough for them to hear, "Children." Lena narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Elijah didn't look up from his phone. Danielle Harris passed their row again, seemingly by coincidence, but her eyes lingered a fraction too long. She noticed the slight shift in Lena's posture, how she sat straighter now, shoulders tense. She saw Elijah holding his phone in both hands, unmoving, as if absorbing every detail on the screen to avoid looking anywhere else. Danielle didn't stop, but when she reached the galley, Andre was waiting. "Row 16 again?" he asked, already reading her expression. "He's giving off that control freak energy," Danielle said as she organized beverage cups, not yelling, not doing anything on paper, but the vibes. "Off," Andre nodded. "Same guy who wanted a seat change?" "Yep." Complained they were being disruptive. But they weren't. They're just teens trying to stay sane in economy class. Andre pulled the coffee pot from its base. "You want me to do the snack service?" "Keep a close eye." Danielle gave a grateful smile. "You read my mind." As Andre prepped the cart, Danielle paused. "It's more than control." The boy's black. The girl might be Latina or mixed. The man keeps looking at them like they violated some social code just by existing next to him. Andre didn't need more explanation. After over a decade working flights from Atlanta to Los Angeles, they both had stories that never made the news, never required an air marshal, but left bruises nonetheless. "I'll keep it smooth," he said. "Let me know if it escalates." Back in row 16, Lena whispered, "We could start talking really loudly about gender studies or critical race theory." "See if his head explodes." Elijah cracked a smile. "Tempting, but probably not a great idea, with 3 hours left in this tin can." Lena sighed. "It's just exhausting, how someone can ruin the air around them without even raising their voice." "He's used to control," Elijah said, his voice low. "People moving when he speaks." "The silence now? It probably feels like rebellion to him." Gregory stirred beside them, shifting his tablet closer to the edge of his tray, then folding his arms as if to say this conversation is over, even though he hadn't said a word. Henry Callahan, 7 rows back, caught the exchange, the hush that didn't feel peaceful. He had spent a lifetime noticing body language, reading people for what they didn't say. He wasn't sure what he'd do yet, but he'd seen enough to know that row 16 was headed somewhere dangerous. Not loud dangerous. Subtle dangerous, the kind that simmers until it scalds. As Andre began the snack service, he offered each row a practiced smile, casual greetings, and polite questions. But when he reached row 16, his smile changed, just slightly. Softer at the corners. His tone dropped, just enough for it to feel human, rather than scripted. "Drinks or snacks for you folks?" "Water, please," Elijah said. "Same," Lena added. "I'll have a scotch on the rocks," Gregory said, not looking up from his tablet. Andre noted it, a double earlier. Another now. He made a mental note. "Coming right up." A few rows later, as he restocked from the galley, He whispered to Danielle, "He's drinking more, still acting cold, but watching them. Especially the boy." Danielle didn't answer right away. She wiped the edge of a tray, eyes far away. "I've seen this story," she said quietly. "And I don't like how it ends." Half an hour passed. Gregory finished his drink, then turned. "So, young man," he said to Elijah, "what brings you to Los Angeles? Visiting family?" Elijah hesitated, surprised by the question. The sudden friendliness didn't match the hours of silence. "Still," he answered politely, "I'm competing in the National Science Decathlon." Gregory raised his eyebrows. "Is that so?" "Impressive." Lena leaned forward. "He's one of 12 finalists nationwide. His project's on gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers." Gregory blinked. "Fascinating," he said flatly. "What do your parents do?" The question came too quickly, too pointedly. Elijah answered with the calm of someone used to answering just this way. "My father is a cardiothoracic surgeon. My mother teaches comparative literature." Something shifted in Gregory's face. A flicker of discomfort, maybe surprise, maybe something else. "Well," he said, lifting his empty cup, "it's always encouraging to see young people from diverse backgrounds excelling academically. Shows what's possible with the right opportunities." There it was. The compliment that wasn't. Lena tensed. Elijah said nothing. Gregory wasn't done. "When I was young, we didn't have all these special programs and diversity initiatives. We had to earn our achievements." Lena looked up sharply. "Funny how merit alone always seemed to favor one kind of person back then." Gregory turned to her, his smile thinning. "Young lady, you clearly don't understand how the real world works. These days, the pendulum has swung so far that qualified candidates are being passed over just to meet quotas." Lena's voice was cool. "Is that what happened to you?" "Got passed over?" Gregory flushed. "I've had a successful career, but I've seen it happen to others." "That must be tough," Lena said sweetly. "Almost as tough as being excluded for centuries." Gregory's eyes narrowed. "You'll understand when you're older. The world isn't as simple as your social studies textbooks." "You're right," Elijah said, speaking up for the first time. "It's not simple, which is why pretending we're all on the same playing field is misleading." Gregory leaned forward. "And what would you know about that?" "That real merit only exists when opportunity is equal," Elijah replied evenly. "And we're not there yet." The tension crackled, and then, as if on cue, Andre appeared beside their row, holding the snack cart, his voice casual and warm. "How are we doing over here?" "Anyone need a refill?" The interruption wasn't random, it was a line in the sand. Gregory swallowed his next comment. Elijah turned toward the window, his jaw tight. Lena didn't look away from Gregory. Not this time. In the galley, Danielle glanced toward row 16. Something had shifted, and they all felt it. The cabin had grown dimmer now. Shades were down across most windows, and overhead lights had been lowered to a soft amber hue. It was the artificial twilight of an aircraft cruising at 36,000 feet, a space suspended from the world below, yet pulsing with its same tensions and unspoken rules. Elijah Carter had just closed his eyes when it happened. It began as a minor thing, a bump, a soft thud. Elijah had leaned slightly toward Lena Ruiz to tuck his phone back into his hoodie pocket. In doing so, his elbow brushed against the coffee cup resting on Gregory Tate's tray table. The cup tipped, and a small splash of lukewarm liquid landed on the corner of Gregory's tablet. What happened next didn't belong in the economy cabin of a commercial flight. Gregory jerked upright with a sharp intake of breath, swiping his tablet with a napkin as if a catastrophe had unfolded. "Watch it," he snapped, his voice louder than anything he'd said so far. Heads turned. "It was an accident," Elijah said calmly, carefully. His voice stayed low. "Measured." Gregory's face flushed a mottled red. "Is that what you call it? You've been bumping me, whispering, laughing for hours. Some people are trying to work." Lena leaned forward, her voice sharper now. "Seriously. You've been rude to us this entire flight." It was a splash of coffee. Gregory's glare moved from Elijah to Lena and back again. "Of course you'd defend him." The words were like flint against dry kindling. Danielle Harris, at the front of the cabin, heard the shift in tone before the volume increased. Years of experience gave her the ability to read a cabin like a seismograph reads tremors. This wasn't background turbulence anymore. She began walking toward row 16. Gregory stood. It was sudden, far too sudden. The aisle was still crowded. Passengers were just beginning to stir from naps, reaching for magazines, earbuds, water bottles. "You people think you can do whatever you want," Gregory said, voice raised. "Make a mess, disrupt everything, and then hide behind excuses when someone calls you out." "You people?" Lena said, rising partway from her seat. "Elijah," Gregory continued, ignoring her. "You're lucky I don't report this to—" Elijah stood now too, still calm, still composed. "I said it was an accident," he repeated. "You need to lower your voice." Gregory's face twisted. "Don't tell me what to do." And then he did something no one expected. He raised his hand, not in a full swing, not in a punch, but in a gesture, a quick, open-handed slap across Elijah's cheek, not hard enough to knock him back, but loud. Sharp, audible, the cabin fell still. For a moment, all air seemed to leave the space around row 16. Lena gasped, rising fully now, hand pressed to her mouth. Elijah didn't move. His face turned slightly to the side, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. His eyes blinked once. Then came the voice, firm, resonant, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Sir." "Step away from him." Henry Callahan was on his feet. He didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard him. The quiet authority in his tone carried weight that no shout ever could. Gregory turned. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Henry said, "and you need to step back." "Now!" Flight attendant Danielle arrived at that moment, her steps quick and sure. "What happened here?" she asked, voice calm but edged with steel. Lena spoke first. "He hit him. Elijah didn't do anything. He spilled a drop of coffee and—" "He assaulted a minor," Henry interrupted. "And I saw the whole thing." Gregory looked around, suddenly aware that dozens of passengers were watching. Phones had begun to rise, cameras were already rolling. It was too late to backpedal. Danielle signaled to Andre at the back of the plane. "Get the captain," she said under her breath. "And notify ground security. We'll need police at the gate." Andre disappeared down the aisle. Gregory stepped back, his hands slightly raised. "This is blown out of proportion. He was being disrespectful, and I reacted." "You reacted by slapping a child," Henry said, "at 36,000 feet. In front of half the cabin." "I'll file a complaint," Gregory snapped. "You go ahead," Danielle said evenly. "But right now, you need to return to your seat and stay there until we land. Or you can choose to remain standing and meet the officers at the gate in handcuffs." Gregory stared at her, his breathing shallow. He looked toward the back of the cabin, toward the passengers still filming, and he sat. Elijah hadn't spoken. Danielle turned to him. "Are you okay?" He nodded. "Barely." Lena touched his arm gently. "Elijah, I'm fine," he said quietly. "Really?" Danielle squatted down slightly to meet his gaze. "We'll take your statement when we land. You don't have to do anything now. Just breathe." He gave a nod that barely moved his chin. Henry placed a hand on the headrest in front of Elijah. "You handled that with more grace than most grown men could." Elijah looked up at him for the first time. And something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or the quiet bond of those who have endured. Danielle rose, motioned to Andre, and began moving through the cabin, reassuring passengers. The crisis was contained for now, but the damage had been done. And for Elijah, the bruise wasn't just on his cheek. It was on the part of him that had tried so hard to stay small, to be polite, to do everything right. He had followed every rule, and still, it hadn't been enough to stop a stranger's hand. The cabin of Flight 1742 was no longer calm. It wasn't chaos, not quite, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. A ripple had passed through the passengers. It moved from seat to seat, row to row, in glances and whispers, in the silent tension of people unsure of what they had just witnessed. A man had slapped a child, and not just any child. A black teenager who had been quiet, respectful, trying to mind his own business. The sting of that act lingered in the air long after Gregory Tate sank back into his seat. He didn't speak again. He didn't even look at Elijah Carter. But that didn't erase what had happened. Danielle Harris and Andre Wilson moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, doing their best to restore a sense of order. But the usual rhythm of a flight, the soft rustle of magazines, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional ding of a call button, had been replaced with something else. Discomfort, guilt, awareness. Some passengers avoided eye contact altogether. Others watched Elijah and Lena with open concern. A few still stared at Gregory, their faces hard with disapproval. From the front of the cabin, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been made aware of a passenger incident. Law enforcement will meet us at the gate upon landing. We ask everyone to remain calm and seated until instructed to deplane. Thank you for your cooperation." Elijah sat perfectly still. The right side of his face burned. It wasn't just the physical sting, it was the humiliation, the heat of eyes on him. The knowledge that somewhere in the cloud of witnesses, someone would say he must have done something. Someone always did. Lena Ruiz hadn't stopped looking at him since the slap. Her fury had cooled, but it simmered under the surface. She'd offered him water, a tissue, even just silence, but Elijah hadn't wanted anything. Not yet. He just wanted to disappear. 7 rows back, Henry Callahan had not returned to his book. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on row 16. He had risen on instinct, spoken without thinking. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the past was pressing on him like never before. He had seen this before. He had seen James Henderson, a man who had saved his life during the war, reduced to silence in the face of cruelty. Not by a slap, but by a system. By rules that said his sacrifice didn't matter as much because of the color of his skin, because his name didn't belong on plaques or medals. And now, Henry had watched his grandson relive a piece of that same injustice. At least, Henry was almost certain. Because when Elijah had looked up at him, just after the slap, eyes wide with confusion and betrayal, there was something hauntingly familiar in that gaze, the same intensity, the same quiet dignity, the same fire James had carried even when it almost cost him everything. Henry reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out the photograph, black and white, faded at the corners. Two soldiers, arms slung together, one smiling, one half smiling. Both young, both standing in the red dust of a Vietnamese camp, with years of life still ahead. Henry stared at the face on the right. James, his best friend, his brother in battle. And the man Henry had failed when it mattered most. Because when it had come time to speak up, to protect James the way James had protected him, Henry had stayed silent. Now, decades later, maybe fate had handed him a second chance. Across the aisle, an elderly woman leaned toward Henry. "I saw what you did," she whispered, standing up like that. "That was brave." Henry shook his head. "No, ma'am, that was overdue." He tucked the photograph back into his pocket and stood again. This time, more slowly. He didn't approach row 16 directly. Instead, he stepped into the aisle and waited for Danielle Harris, who was returning with a clipboard. "I need to speak with the boy," Henry said gently. Danielle looked up, surprised. "Sir, we'll be taking statements once we land. I understand you witnessed the incident, and the officers will want to." "I will give them my statement," Henry assured her. "But I'd like to speak to him first, just for a moment." "If that's allowed?" Danielle hesitated. Something in Henry's eyes, calm but intense, told her this wasn't about interference. It was something else. She nodded. "Make it quick," she said, stepping aside. Henry walked forward. Each step toward row 16 was heavy, as if the past walked with him. When he reached the row, he didn't address Gregory Tate. He didn't even look at him. He turned instead to Elijah and gently leaned in beside him. "May I?" he asked. Elijah looked up, unsure. Henry lowered his voice. "My name is Henry Callahan," he said. "I served in Vietnam with a man named James Henderson. Your grandfather, I believe." Elijah blinked. His mouth parted slightly. "I don't expect you to know me," Henry went on, "but I recognized you the moment you looked at me. You have his eyes, his stillness. He once saved my life." Elijah said nothing at first. Then, "My grandfather passed when I was 6. I don't remember him well." "I do," Henry said softly, "and I've carried a debt to him for over 40 years. Lena turned to listen too, sensing the moment. "I didn't protect him when I should have," Henry said. "I stayed quiet when others came for him, not with fists, but with policy, with silence. I can't undo that, but when I saw you, I knew I wouldn't make that mistake again." He paused. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. And I'm here for whatever comes next." Elijah didn't answer immediately, but his posture softened. Just a little. He nodded. Henry nodded back, then stepped aside and returned to his seat, the weight in his chest just slightly lifted. Behind them, the plane began its slow descent toward Los Angeles. But for Elijah, for Lena, for Henry, everything was already different. They had passed a threshold, and the next part of their story would begin on solid ground. Flight 1742 touched down at LAX with a gentle bump, but the tension inside the cabin remained anything but soft. Passengers stayed unusually quiet as the plane taxied to the gate. There were no eager hands reaching for bags, no rustling to get up before the seatbelt sign blinked off. Instead, there was a hush, a watchful stillness that hung between every row, especially near 16C. Gregory Tate had not said another word since the slap. His face remained tight, his eyes cast forward like stone. He didn't dare look at Elijah Carter, not at Lena Ruiz. Certainly not at Henry Callahan. When the aircraft finally rolled to a complete stop, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign was followed by a stern announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, we ask that everyone remain seated while airport security assists with an onboard situation. Please do not stand or retrieve your belongings until directed by the crew." Gregory didn't flinch, but Elijah could feel his pulse rising again, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what came next. The moment when his voice would matter, when his truth would need to be spoken clearly, with no cracks, no shaking. Danielle Harris appeared once more at row 16, this time joined by Andre Wilson and two uniformed airport police officers. One officer, a tall black man with a clipped but calm demeanor, stepped forward. "Mr. Gregory Tate?" Gregory stood slowly. "Yes. But I'd like to clarify. You'll have an opportunity to give your statement," the officer said. "Please come with us." He turned to Elijah. "And you are Mr. Elijah Carter?" Elijah nodded. "We'll speak with you next, after the cabin is cleared." Gregory hesitated, his hand gripping the headrest. "This whole thing has been exaggerated," he muttered. "You assaulted a minor," Danielle said quietly. "There's nothing exaggerated about that." Gregory's face went pale, but he said nothing else. The officers led him forward through the narrow aisle. A few passengers clapped softly, awkwardly. Others simply stared. As Gregory disappeared through the cabin door, the remaining passengers began to collect their belongings. Bags were pulled down, coats shrugged on, and the ordinary routine of deplaning resumed. But for row 16, nothing felt routine. Lena touched Elijah's arm. "You okay?" He gave a slow nod. "I think so." "Do you want me to wait with you?" she asked. Elijah opened his mouth to say no, that she didn't have to, but then he stopped himself. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." From behind them, Henry Callahan also rose. He had no intention of letting the boy walk into that room alone. Danielle gestured to the three of them. "Security has a space set up inside the terminal. You'll all give statements there." As they stepped off the plane, the bright fluorescence of LAX hit them like a wall. The terminal was busy, normal passengers rushing to gates, flight crews walking briskly, the soundtrack of arrivals and departures humming in the background. But a security cordon had been established at a quiet corner near Gate 52. An officer waved Elijah, Lena, and Henry toward a seating area with 3 plain plastic chairs and a folding table. A detective introduced himself, Detective Marshall, badge clipped to his belt, voice measured but kind. "We've reviewed witness accounts and a few videos already posted online," he began. "We understand this was an unprovoked physical assault. I want to thank you for cooperating, Elijah. I know this isn't easy." Elijah sat upright, his voice steady. "I'm ready to tell you what happened." Lena reached over, squeezing his hand once before letting go. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elijah gave a clear, factual account, his movements, the spilled coffee, the sudden strike. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. but the truth in his voice landed with unmistakable weight. Detective Marshall nodded. You have the option to press formal charges. Because you're a minor, your parent or guardian will also need to be involved. I'd like to talk to my dad, Elijah said. I've already texted him, Lena added. He's on his way. Henry, who had sat silently until now, leaned forward. If I may, he said, I'd like to offer something. The detective glanced at him. You're his, not family, Henry said, but I believe I knew his grandfather. James Henderson. We served together. Elijah turned. You knew my grandfather? Henry nodded. He was one of the best men I've ever known. Detective Marshall allowed a brief pause. Go ahead. Henry's voice softened. I don't know if Elijah knows the full story of what James did during the war. How he saved lives, how he stood up for people, especially when it cost him, and how I didn't. Not when I should have. He glanced at Elijah. I see him in you, Henry said. Not just in your face, but in the way you carry yourself. The way you held your composure today, James would be proud. Elijah's eyes stung, but he didn't look away. I didn't know much about him, he admitted, only that he passed when I was little. My dad never talked about the war. Henry nodded slowly. Maybe someday I can tell you more if you want to hear it. I do, Elijah said. Lena touched her chest and smiled. This day just keeps turning into a movie. They shared a quiet moment of relief, but it didn't last long. The detective returned to the matter at hand. Elijah, you don't need to decide now about charges, but we will need to know by tomorrow. I understand, Elijah said. I'll talk to my dad and call you. The detective handed him a business card. Whatever you choose, we support you. But just so you know, you've already made an impression, and you've already started something. Elijah tilted his head. Started what? Something important, the detective said. A conversation, a reckoning. They stood, bags over shoulders, plastic chairs empty behind them. Henry, walking beside Elijah, added quietly, and maybe for me, a chance to make peace with the past. As they stepped into the main terminal and the normal world rushed around them, suitcases rolling, children running, announcements overhead, Elijah realized something had changed. He wasn't just the kid from row 16 anymore. He was a witness, a symbol, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. The sun had dipped below the Los Angeles skyline by the time Dr. David Carter pulled up outside the West Side Inn, a modest hotel near UCLA where Elijah's science decathlon team was staying. The soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the dusty windshield of the rental car as David spotted his son standing just outside the lobby. Elijah looked different. It wasn't his clothes or his posture. It was something in the eyes. A stillness, a maturity that hadn't been there when David had hugged him goodbye that morning in Atlanta. David parked hastily and stepped out. Elijah, he called. His son turned, and for a moment, David saw the child Elijah used to be, the one who used to run across soccer fields and into his arms. But that child had grown. What stood before him now was someone changed, someone older than his 16 years. David walked briskly to him and pulled him into a hug. You all right? He asked, voice rougher than he intended. Tell me the truth. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. I'm okay, Dad, just tired. David stepped back, examining his face. His eyes landed on the faint red mark still lingering on Elijah's cheek. That him? He asked. That man? Elijah nodded. David's jaw clenched. I should have been on that plane with you, he muttered. I'm glad you weren't, Elijah said. It would have made it worse. David looked at his son carefully. Did you do everything right? I tried, Elijah said. I was respectful. I kept calm. I said sorry, but it didn't matter. David exhaled slowly. It never has, son. That's what I've tried to teach you. You can do everything right, follow every rule, and still, it finds you. There was silence between them for a moment. The sounds of the city filtered in, distant horns, footsteps on concrete, the faint rumble of planes overhead. Did you hit him back? David asked. No, Elijah said quietly. I wanted to, but I didn't. David gave a slow, approving nod. Good. Because if you had, we'd be having a very different conversation right now, and it wouldn't matter who started it. Elijah looked down at his sneakers. I don't want this to define me. It doesn't, David said. But how you handle it might. They sat down on a low concrete bench near the hotel entrance, the last traces of sunlight reflected in the hotel's glass doors. The detective said, I can press charges, Elijah said after a while. It's up to us. David sighed and rubbed his hands together. What do you want to do? Elijah shrugged. Part of me wants to walk away. Just forget it happened. And the other part wants him to feel something. Consequences, accountability. David nodded. That man, Gregory Tate, you know what he is? A racist, Elijah said. Yes, David replied. But more than that, he's a man who's spent his life thinking the world belongs to him. A man who's never had to question what happens when he crosses a line. You pressing charges wouldn't just be about justice for you. It would be about letting the world know, his world know, that you're not afraid to call it out. Elijah looked up. But is that fair to me? To carry that weight? David put a hand on his shoulder. Son, being a black man in this country means you'll carry weight whether you choose to or not. The question is, will you carry it in silence, or will you decide how it's used? There was a long pause between them, and then Elijah said, There's a man who helped me on the plane. His name's Henry Callahan. David raised an eyebrow. I saw his name in one of the police reports. The Vietnam vet? Yeah, Elijah said. He said he knew Grandpa James, that they served together. David's expression changed, softened, then tightened again, like a door opening and closing halfway. I didn't know many details about my father's service, David admitted. He never talked about it. I think it hurt too much. He said Grandpa saved his life, Elijah added, and that he didn't return the favor. He said he stayed silent when it mattered. David stared out at the street. Cars passed by, headlights flickering like fireflies in the city dusk. I never knew that, he murmured. I always thought Dad came back bitter because of the war itself, but maybe it was something deeper. Elijah looked at his father. Would you want to meet Henry? David didn't answer right away. I think I would, he said finally, if only to say thank you, and maybe to ask a few questions I've been carrying for a long time. They stood together. The moment between them felt fragile, like old glass that had somehow held its shape. So, David asked, you want to press charges? Elijah thought about it, really thought, about his grandfather, about Henry, about Lena's steady presence, about the slap, and the silence that had followed. Yes, he said. I do. David put a hand on his son's shoulder again, firmer this time. Then we'll do it together. The morning sun over Los Angeles was pale and quiet, casting long golden shafts across the glass windows of the UCLA Science Auditorium. Inside, the National Science Decathlon was already underway. Dozens of high school students moved between poster boards, laptop displays, and presentation panels with the focused energy of young minds chasing something bigger than themselves. Elijah Carter stood in front of his display, gravitational waves, black hole mergers, quantum echoes. The title he had chosen weeks ago now felt strangely poetic. Measuring the Invisible. It had been less than 24 hours since the incident on Flight 1742, but to Elijah, it felt like weeks. The sting on his cheek had faded to a faint warmth. The pressure in his chest had given way to something else. Resolve. His father stood nearby, arms crossed, watching quietly, but with visible pride. He hadn't hovered or tried to direct. He had simply shown up, and that was enough. And then, through the glass doors at the far end of the hall, Elijah saw him. Henry Callahan, wearing a clean button-down, dark slacks, and an old wristwatch that looked like it had crossed time zones and wars. He walked slowly, with the careful dignity of a man who understood how precious each step was. Elijah met him halfway. "You came," he said, not as a question. Henry smiled. "I said I would." They shook hands, no fanfare, no awkwardness. Just two generations meeting in the middle of a history neither of them could fully explain. "Thank you," Elijah said. Henry looked around the room. "You know, the last time I was in a place like this, I was 23, watching your grandfather speak at a city council meeting in D.C. He was trying to get housing reform passed for veterans." Elijah blinked. "I didn't know he did that." "Most people didn't," Henry said. "He didn't do it for recognition." They stood side by side now, watching the other students. A quiet bond, newly formed, yet rooted in old soil. "My dad's here," Elijah said. "Do you want to meet him?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. David Carter approached slowly, unsure of how to greet this man who had once stood beside his father in the jungles of Southeast Asia. "Dr. Carter," Henry said gently, extending his hand. David accepted it. "Mr. Callahan, thank you for what you did yesterday for my son." Henry shook his head. "It was long overdue for both of you." There was a pause. Then David said quietly, "He never talked about the war, about what happened over there." "I don't blame him," Henry said, "but if you'd ever like to know more about him, about that time, I'd be willing to talk." David nodded slowly. "I think we'd both like that." Behind them, Elijah's name was called over the speaker. He turned toward the stage. David placed a firm hand on his back. "Go knock them dead." Elijah walked up to the microphone. The lights were bright. The judges leaned in. For a moment, the room went silent. Then he spoke calmly, clearly. Passionately, he talked about gravitational waves, about invisible patterns moving through the fabric of space and time. He talked about measurement, about accuracy, about how the smallest disruptions could carry meaning across light years. And without planning it, he found himself closing with something different, something personal. "We spend a lot of time measuring things we can't see," he said. "Forces, gravity, motion. But sometimes the most powerful things, the most real, aren't measurable at all, like justice, or courage, or choosing to do the right thing, even when it costs you something." He paused. And sometimes those things don't leave graphs or formulas behind. Just people, trying to carry them forward. He ended there. No one clapped immediately. It was the kind of silence that meant something had landed. Then the applause came, slow, then swelling. Elijah stepped off the stage and returned to his father and Henry. He didn't need to ask how he'd done. He could see it in their eyes. Later that afternoon, as the event came to a close and teams began packing up, Elijah and Henry sat outside on a shaded bench. "This isn't the end, is it?" Elijah asked. Henry shook his head. "No. Just a continuation. You think we'll stay in touch?" "I hope so," Henry said. "But either way, what happened on that plane? What happened today? It's part of the story now. Yours, mine, your grandfather's. It's all connected." Elijah looked down at the old wristwatch on Henry's arm. "Is that from the war?" Henry nodded. "Stopped working in 1975? I never got it fixed." "Why not?" "I didn't deserve to wear it. Not until I made something right." They sat in silence for a while, just breathing, watching the shadows lengthen. "Feels like something came full circle," Elijah said. "It did," Henry replied. "But circles are just the start of new orbits. You'll take it from here." That night, as the sun disappeared over the Pacific, a 16-year-old boy stood on a hotel balcony, thinking about war, science, and justice, about voices loud and quiet, about people who step in when others stay seated, and about a grandfather he barely remembered, but now felt closer to than ever. Flight 1742 reminds us that courage doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's as simple and as powerful as standing up when others remain seated. For those of us who've lived long enough to witness the ongoing struggle for justice in America, this story is a quiet but potent reminder. We are never too old to do what's right. Elijah Carter showed grace beyond his years. He reminded us that dignity is not defined by how others treat us, but by how we choose to respond. And Henry Callahan, a retired veteran haunted by silence in his past, reminded us that it's never too late to make amends or to protect what is right in front of us. As we age, we often wonder if our voices still matter. This story answers that with a resounding yes. Every generation needs examples of quiet strength. Every community needs those who've walked through history to guide the next. Sometimes, the most meaningful legacy we leave isn't wealth or success, but the simple choice to stand up, speak truth, and offer our presence when it's needed most. It's never too late to be part of the change.